He slaughtered 12 men in a single night just because they found out her name. When a rival mafia family targeted a simple waitress to get to the city's biggest crime boss, he didn't negotiate. Dante Varley walked back into their apartment at 3 a.m. covered in blood, looked her dead in the eye, and confessed to eliminating an entire operation to keep her safe. Then, she helped him wash the blood off his hands in the shower. How far would you let someone go to protect you?
Picture the exact moment a human mind begins to fracture under impossible weight. You and I are going to step into this scene together and watch a quiet tragedy unfold. The camera pans down to Ara, a waitress who's spent 2 years mastering the art of being invisible, shoulders hunched, face wiped clean of emotion, floating past the private rooms like a ghost. But tonight, the illusion breaks. The sharp crack of crystal shatters against the heavy table of Dante Varley, a syndicate boss who dictates life and death with a single nod. The room freezes, bracing for violence. Instead, Dante simply watches her. The lesson here is chilling but true. A burst of rage is easy to survive, but the quiet, lingering stare of a predator will break your spirit long before he ever touches you. Ara knew all too well that seeing too much was the quickest way to end up dead. The air inside the restaurant felt incredibly heavy that Tuesday. The lighting seemed unnaturally dim. Marcus, the floor manager, pulled her into the shadows of the hallway. Sweat beaded on his pale forehead, his hands trembling as he told her the private room server called in sick. Ara was going in. He grabbed her shoulders, pleading with her to follow the rules of survival. Keep your eyes on the floor. Don't speak. Forget everything you hear. A cold rush of panic flooded her veins as she desperately searched for a way out. But there is a heavy truth we all eventually face. Sometimes, the most terrifying burdens are forced upon our shoulders exactly when we're the most desperate to run away. The urge to run was screaming in her chest, but the crushing weight of her unpaid bills locked her feet to the floor. Ara swallowed her terror and took the tray. As the guests walked in, all the ambient noise in the room simply died out. Looking through the frosted kitchen window, she watched them take their seats. 6 men with cold eyes, 1 woman wearing a sharp red dress, and right in the center, Dante Varley. You could see the raw power in his posture. The others sat inches away from him, trapped in his dark orbit. He didn't have to raise his voice or demand respect. The space simply warped around his presence. It reminds us of a dark reality. True power never has to shout to make you tremble. It just sits quietly and waits for the room to surrender. Beside her, an older line cook muttered Dante's name and crossed himself as if the devil had just ordered a meal. Ara locked her jaw, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and stepped into the lion's den. She kept her eyes glued to the expensive crystal glasses, moving with the stiff grace of a wind-up doll. For an entire hour, she was a ghost. They openly discussed violent crimes, treating her like a piece of furniture. She forced her brain to go numb, hearing their dark secrets, but refusing to understand them. It worked beautifully until her tired nerves slipped. She looked up. Dante was already staring right at her. It teaches us a brutal lesson. We can spend years building the perfect walls to protect ourselves, only to tear them down with one careless glance. Stick with me, because this is where the air in the room turns completely to ice. Dante's face was a blank, terrifying canvas. Ara couldn't tell if he was amused by her or deciding how to dispose of her. Those 3 seconds of eye contact felt like a lifetime. She practically ran back to the kitchen, her chest heaving, as she tried to catch her breath. Marcus saw her shaking, but she pushed past him, grabbing the next bottle of wine. She walked back into the suffocating room. The woman in red blew a cloud of smoke right into Ara's path. As Ara reached for a glass, one of the men threw his arm back. He hit her wrist hard. Time slowed down. The bottle slipped from her fingers. The lesson is cruel. Pure panic always makes our hands fail when we need them the most. The heavy glass exploded against the table, sending dark red wine splattering across the white linen like a fresh wound. The entire room went dead silent. Ara stopped breathing, her body frozen over the jagged shards of glass. A pathetic, ragged apology barely made it past her lips. Then Dante finally spoke. He said it was fine. His voice was smooth, completely flat and terrifyingly calm. He dabbed at the stain, watching her squirm. When she tried to beg for forgiveness, his quiet look snapped her mouth shut instantly. Then he turned to his own man, Carlo, and ordered him to apologize to the waitress. Carlo turned the color of ash. There is a dark truth here. The cruelest men don't just punish mistakes, they weaponize them to put chains on everyone else in the room. Dante quietly told her to bring another bottle. Ara could barely feel her own legs. Her fingers trembled so violently, she nearly cut herself on the broken glass. Marcus rushed in to sweep up the mess, while the men went right back to casually discussing their violent trades. When Ara returned, she gripped the new bottle like a lifeline. She could feel their eyes peeling away her defenses. Yet, somehow, she pushed the terror down into her stomach and finished pouring the wine. When she finally asked to leave, Dante gave her a polite, gentle smile that felt exactly like a threat. She collapsed against the kitchen tiles, gasping for air. It's a harsh reality of life. Sometimes, a polite thank you from a monster is far more damaging than a screaming threat from a stranger. A kind coworker pushed a glass of water into her shaking hands, whispering that she was lucky to walk out of there alive. But a dangerous seed was already planted in Ara's mind. Why did a man so violent show her such mercy? This is how the tragedy always begins. We desperately try to find warmth in the cold hands of our abusers. Marcus met her by the back door, his voice thick with fear. He warned her that men like Dante never forget a face they find interesting. It suddenly hit her. She was now on the radar of a predator. She promised to be careful and walked out into the freezing night air. The alley was pitch black. Her car was 3 blocks away. It goes to show that we often step out of one nightmare only to realize we're walking completely blind into another. She had to park in the dark because she simply couldn't afford the lighted garage. Then she heard it. The slow, rhythmic crunch of footsteps behind her. You and I both know the oldest rule of survival. If you run, the wolf is going to chase you. Ara forced herself to keep a steady walking pace, her heart threatening to break her ribs. Suddenly, a voice echoed in the cold air. She spun around. It was one of Dante's men. He stood just out of reach, his hands in his pockets, completely relaxed. He smiled and said, Dante wanted to make sure she got to her car safely. The cruelty was brilliant. He was using the terror of the dark alley to make her feel indebted to him. The lesson is clear. The deadliest traps in life are always painted to look exactly like a rescue. Let us look at this closely together, because the real damage always happens when the screaming stops. They walked the rest of the way in total silence. Ara wanted to scream, to ask what he wanted, but fear kept her mouth wired shut. She shoved her key into the rusty door of her car. The man leaned against the hood, watching her hands shake. He told her she was safe, whispering that next time she shouldn't grip the wine bottle so tightly. Ara could only nod. Once inside, she locked the doors and sat there in the dark, watching him fade into the shadows. The drive home was an empty blur. There is a tragic irony in human survival. Our fear teaches us to shrink down and hide in the shadows, but sometimes those shadows are exactly where the darkest monsters live. Once she was locked inside her apartment, her legs gave out. She brewed a cup of tea, but just stared at the rising steam. Her instincts screamed at her to pack a bag, quit her job, and disappear into the night. But the crushing weight of her debts kept her trapped in that room. Life doesn't care if you're terrified. The bills still come due. She convinced herself she just needed to work harder at being invisible. The next night, she took a double shift in the main room, hoping the noise would drown out her fear. But by Thursday night, the nightmare walked right back through the front door zone. It's a bitter truth that breaks so many hearts. You can pack up and run as fast as you want, but you can never hide from someone who's already mapped out your weaknesses. Dante walked into the crowded restaurant completely alone, wearing a casual suit and a charming smile. Ara froze dead in her tracks. All the breath left her lungs as the hostess led him straight to her section. This wasn't a mistake. Monsters love to pull their victims away from the herd. Her mind screamed for her to run out the back door, but her feet were glued to the floor. He looked up, an amused smirk playing on his lips, and asked if she was just going to stand there. Her training kicked in, and she quietly asked what he wanted to drink. He ordered his scotch and told her to surprise him. She hurried to the bar to get the most expensive bottle they had. It's a fatal human flaw. When cornered by a threat, we foolishly try to prove how useful we can be. Watch the slight tremor in her hands. Her drink choice was a calculated shield. Returning to the amber-lit booth, she found Varley illuminated by the cold glow of his phone. She set the glass down, hyper-aware of her own ragged breathing. He praised the drink, his voice thick with suffocating patience. Then came the pivot. "Sit down," he commanded softly. Every instinct screamed at her to run, yet she perched on the leather seat like a trapped bird. "Relax," he soothed. She twisted her apron, whispering she was on the clock. "You are working. I am asking you to sit." He was reshaping her reality. When she finally asked what he wanted, he simply apologized. We often look for monsters in the shadows, but true manipulation almost always wears the quiet, disarming mask of humility. The apology hit her like a physical blow. The camera lingers on her face, capturing the cognitive shock. She searched his eyes, noting faint scars and a weary, tragic humanity. He shifted the blame for the shattered bottle onto his associate. "You handled it well," he praised, rewarding her suppression. He saw the raw fear in her posture. When she admitted it, he nodded. "Smart, but you do not have to be, not unless you give me a reason." It was a flawless trap, an illusion of safety built on total surrender. Then, he casually asked about the food. The emotional whiplash left her gasping. She took his order, desperate to flee. The painful truth is that someone who shatters your reality often does so just to become the only solid ground left to stand on. Hearing her name on his lips paralyzed her. The ambient noise of the room seems to fade entirely. He leaned in, telling her to request the private room tomorrow for a lucrative party. When she questioned him, the dim lighting caught his disarming smile. "Because you need the money," he reasoned, framing his manipulation as a rare gift. She wanted to reject his shadow, but poverty forced her head to bow. For the rest of the evening, Varley became a ghost. He ate quietly and left a standard 20% tip. This performance of normalcy is a calculated weapon. By acting flawlessly, he eroded her desperate fear, leaving a toxic gratitude in its place. Life teaches us a hard lesson here. Gifts from those who seek control are never free. They are simply early down payments on your absolute compliance. You and I know the mere absence of a threat is not true safety. For Ara, the following weeks felt like standing in the dead center of a hurricane. She worked the event as orchestrated, earning triple her income. Crucially, she walked to her car at midnight alone. Then, Varley vanished for 2 full weeks. This withdrawal is a brutal emotional starvation tactic. It forces the target to unconsciously crave the predator's presence. Spring arrived, and Ara buried herself in a numb, grey routine. She banked the cash, violently suppressing the memory of his dark eyes. But the tragic seed was already sown. A hard truth of the human heart is that quiet peace can sometimes feel like a void. By removing himself, he ensured her safe life would feel completely hollow compared to the intoxicating focus he had once granted her. Her isolated existence was the perfect tragic stage for a man like him. In April, Varley returned. Same shadowy table, same inescapable demand. When he softly ordered her to sit, weaponizing her name, her exhausted body complied. He asked about her life with calculated intimacy, then casually mentioned her private shifts. She asked how he knew. "I own 20% of this restaurant," he stated. It was a crushing display of omnipotence. Her only safe haven was actually his hunting ground. He leaned in, probing why she needed the cash. She tried to deflect, warning that curiosity was dangerous. His chilling smile caught the low light. "Only if you are not careful," he replied. "We must learn to be wary of those who hold the power." A true manipulator never asks a question without already holding the exact answer. The warm dining room hummed, contrasting the cold psychological cage locking around her. "I am paying off student loans," she confessed. We often surrender our truths to someone who seems all-knowing. He probed deeper, unearthing her buried passion for art history. "But you wanted to," he observed, tracking every flicker of regret. He was not making conversation. He was mapping her unmet desires. When she admitted her abandoned dreams of curation, he delivered a soft, chilling promise. "It might matter," he said. A customer signaled, breaking the heavy spell so she could bolt. She retreated, heart hammering, terrified by the sensation of standing on an emotional precipice. Here is the tragic flaw in human longing. Dark figures will always identify your starved aspirations, quietly making themselves the only key to your deepest dreams. Picture the scene with me. The diner is suffocatingly quiet, the neon sign humming a low rhythm against the damp glass. When Ara steps back to her station, the solitary man is gone, leaving behind 5 crisp $100 bills. Her breath catches. The camera lingers on her trembling fingers. Her colleague, Marcus, leans in close, urging her to keep the cash for rent and simple survival. She slips the money into her apron, unknowingly swallowing the hook. He returns week after week, claiming that exact corner booth. He speaks softly of art, patiently mapping the fragile contours of her mind. The lesson here is tragic. Sometimes, our sheer desperation to survive makes us utterly blind to the invisible traps we willingly walk into. The lighting shifts to the harsh, unforgiving glare of a May afternoon in a crowded cafe. Watch the subtle, devastating change in Ara. She no longer feels violated by his gaze. Instead, she feels seen. Her friend Jenna leans across the small table, coffee growing cold, desperately trying to intervene. Jenna knows the whispers. She warns Ara that this man carries a brutal history, a shadow painted in blood. Yet Ara's jaw tightens. She defends him, clinging to the illusion that he is just a lonely patron asking about her dreams. But beneath the table, her hands ache from gripping her own knees. She is terrified, realizing Dante Varelli is a predator bleeding into her quiet world. It reminds us of a bitter truth. We often fiercely defend the very illusions destined to destroy us. The camera pushes in close as Ara finally shatters the physical boundary. Listen to the harsh scrape of the wooden chair as she sits at his table completely uninvited. She stares him down, demanding to know why he haunts her section every single Tuesday night. Dante does not flinch. Instead, he offers a low, disarming laugh that fills the quiet room. It is a masterful performance of warmth. He tells her she is the only soul alive who looks at him without calculating his threat. By declaring she is no longer afraid, she seals her own fate. The raw terror inside her has tragically mutated into a fatal curiosity. It is a haunting lesson for us all. The absolute most dangerous illusion a person can hold is the quiet belief that they are the sole exception to a monster's rule. Stick with me here, because this is the exact moment the trap snaps shut. Ara asks, voice barely above a whisper, if she should be afraid. Dante nods slowly. He offers her the most dangerous weapon of all, a partial truth. He confesses that honesty is a luxury he can rarely afford, projecting the profound, aching loneliness of a fallen king. He frames the bloody burden of being Dante Varelli as a sweeping tragedy rather than the consequence of his own brutal choices. When she asks what he truly wants, the heavy silence between them becomes an unspoken pact. A devastating threshold is crossed. This teaches us something vital about human nature. Pity is the lock, and shared loneliness is the key that opens the door to our own ruin. She would regret this night forever. The seasons bleed into a sweltering summer, and the psychological conditioning takes root. Dante vanishes for days only to reappear like a ghost, a calculated starvation designed to make her crave his presence. When he does sit in her section, the tips remain generous but routine, slowly dismantling her defenses. They trade quiet secrets in the dim light. He speaks of a sister in Boston, painting himself as an ordinary man, masking the violence of his true nature. Ara unconsciously memorizes his rhythms, pouring scotch when his shoulders are tight, wine when the storm has passed. But the true horror lies outside. Dark sedans idle in the heat haze beneath her window. The lesson is chilling. We adjust to the creeping darkness so slowly that we forget what the light looked like. The tension finally snaps in late June. You and I are going to watch this climax closely. When Ara confronts him about the shadowy men watching her apartment, Dante does not flinch or lie. He simply admits she has become too important to leave unguarded. The camera frames her trembling hands pressed flat against the cool tabletop. Her nervous system is in full revolt. She begs to be released, pleading that she does not know the brutal rules of his underworld. But Dante slowly leans in, closing the physical gap until the air between them burns. He demands she speak the name of the forbidden bond tying them together. The tragedy is complete. True captivity begins the exact moment we agree to put a name to the invisible chains that hold us down. Let us step into the shadows together, you and I, and watch this tragedy unfold. In the flickering light of the restaurant's back office, Alara stands alone. The staff have long vanished. She is counting her earnings when the muffled thud of violence bleeds through the drywall. Peering through the cracked door, she sees Tommy backed against the cold tile, two shadowed figures gripping heavy steel pipes. His eyes are wide, hollowed out by pure terror. True survival demands absolute stillness, yet human nature is rarely logical. We often rush toward the fire to save another, forgetting we might burn. Driven by blind panic, she bolts toward the dining room security alarm. A floorboard groans loudly under her weight. The violent intruders snap their gaze toward the sound. Eye contact is made. The predator has finally found her. The blare of the alarm tears through the silence like jagged glass. A heavy hand violently shoves her against the wall. The room spins into a blur of raw chaos. Ilara's mind shatters into fragmented flashes, the sickening crack of bone, the rush of cold air, the metallic scent of blood. As the attackers are dragged away, she stumbles backward into a firm chest. Dante, the grand architect of this nightmare, steps into the light, perfectly playing the role of her savior. His hands grip her trembling shoulders, forcing her terrified eyes to meet his cold stare. He pulls her close, and their breathing aligns. The lesson here is deeply tragic. In moments of pure panic, a desperate heart will easily mistake a well-built cage for a sanctuary. She leans into the monster who set the trap, falsely believing she is finally safe. The flashing red strobes of police cruisers paint the restaurant walls, yet the room is thick with quiet corruption. Officers whisper in the shadows, stepping back as Dante dictates the narrative. Wrapped in a foil blanket, Ilara watches him. He does not flinch. His voice remains smooth, a chilling display of sociopathic grace as he charms the lead detective. A heavy realization sets in. You cannot plant a seed in poisoned soil, just as you can never find true peace in the arms of a violent man. Yet, her traumatized mind desperately clings to him. Marcus slumps into a chair beside her, his face aged 10 years in a single night. Through heavy breaths, he confesses the brutal truth. The men on the floor were simply sending a message in blood, trying to intimidate the true king of this unforgiving territory. The ground beneath Ilara crumbles as Marcus reveals the depth of their reality. Dante owns everything. Every shadow in this place belongs to his syndicate. Shivering violently, she lets someone drive her home, staring blindly at the passing streetlights. Inside her tiny apartment, the silence is deafening. She turns on the television, but the empty chatter offers no comfort. True loneliness is rarely the absence of people. It is the terrifying realization that you are entirely unprotected in a dangerous world. Then Erfan lights up the dark room. A single message from Dante. He casually notes that her door should be locked, mentioning his men are already parked downstairs. The unseen net pulls tight. With a few simple words, he effectively erases the outside world, making himself the sole architect of her survival. Watch his shadow move. You and I can see the trap being laid. Dante's voice on the phone is a velvet hammer, using guilt to carefully strip away her independence. When the call drops, Ilara creeps to the glass. Down in the empty street sits a black sedan, a protector or a warden. Sometimes the hands that shield us from the storm are the same ones that build our cage. She spends the night awake, paralyzed by the memory of violence and his heavy promise of safety. By dawn, she is completely hollow. At 9, her phone rings. Dante speaks softly, forging a false intimacy out of their shared sleeplessness. He dictates her extraction, casually mentioning he has already cancelled her work shifts. It is an absolute theft of her autonomy. She should feel fierce, defensive rage right now, yet the blinding anger never arrives. The poison of the trauma bond has already taken root. Instead of feeling outrage at the theft of her freedom, her exhausted body slumps in quiet relief. She asks where he is taking her, a weak attempt to hold on to her crumbling boundaries. But her apartment no longer feels safe. The saddest truth of the human mind is how quickly it will embrace captivity if the outside world feels too dangerous. At noon, a sharply dressed operative named Vincent arrives. No words are exchanged. She climbs into a blacked-out luxury vehicle, watching the familiar city streets fade away behind tinted glass. They arrive at a towering fortress of steel and glass, a monument to extreme wealth and absolute power. Vincent swipes a silent keycard at a hidden access point. The elevator ride to the penthouse is suffocatingly quiet, pulling her irreversibly into the predator's domain. The doors open into a cold, sterile expanse. This is not a home. It is a monument to a dark ego, built to make you feel completely powerless. The massive windows command a godlike view of Lake Michigan. Dante stands silhouetted against the glass. He turns, smoothly claiming she is free to leave. A beautiful lie after systematically destroying her alternatives. He offers a heavy pour of liquor, but she refuses. A vital lesson emerges here. Never accept the poison meant to blind you to the trap. Dante then calmly explains the bloodshed. He names the Castellano faction, brushing off the brutal assault on his employees as minor business friction. He takes a slow sip of his drink. His hand does not shake once. He absorbs human terror with absolute, chilling apathy, completely unaffected by the chaos surrounding him. Dante stares into her eyes, coldly calling her a liability. He takes her deepest fear, that her mere presence will bring death to others, and twists it like a knife. The cruelest way to imprison someone is to convince them they are the actual danger. He mocks the police, making it clear the laws of the outside world no longer exist here. Yet, when he casually orders her to stay locked in his glass tower, something inside Alara snaps. The fog shock burns away into primal rage. She steps forward, trembling with defiance, demanding the truth. If she is a pawn on his blood-soaked chessboard, she refuses to play blindfolded. A heavy silence stretches across the room. Dante's dark eyes narrow, studying her posture. The predator is silently calculating whether this sudden spark of rebellion needs further manipulation, or if the prey must be broken. Let's look at this scene together. Notice how the penthouse perfectly mirrors Dante's soul, vast, frozen, and utterly empty. He speaks of the looming war not as a moral failing, but as a dark law of nature. He plans an understanding, a brutally polite word for murder. His voice drops to a whisper, exposing the true monster beneath the suit. Then comes the ultimate deception. He promises that if she stays quiet, she can return to her old life once the bodies are buried. A profound truth lives here. A dark soul will burn your world to ashes and casually expect you to sweep them up. A dry, humorless laugh escapes Elara's throat. It is the agonizing sound of a spirit finally breaking under his manipulation. She stares out at the sweeping glass walls, the cold reality settling deep into her terrified bones. The illusion of freedom is completely dead. The cage is tightly locked. Ara's voice shakes as she demands the terrifying truth. She asks why a king of the underworld would obsess over an insignificant waitress. In 3 quick strides, Dante violently closes the space between them, a stunning display of restrained, predatory dominance. Leaning in close, he whispers that she makes him feel human. It is a devastating manipulation. He takes the black void of his damaged soul and begs her to fill it. This reveals a deeply tragic lesson. A gentle heart will often bleed itself dry trying to heal a broken monster. Just as a captive slowly falls for their warden, Ara begins to absorb his immense emotional needs as her own sacred duty. By painting himself as the vulnerable victim, he brilliantly guarantees she will feel morally bound to save the exact man who is actively dragging her into a deadly abyss. The weight of his manipulation hits her like a physical blow. Her breathing hitches. Staring into his eyes, she asks him to stay, begging for 2 days to process the reality wrapping around her throat. Then, the ultimate terror settles deep within her. She no longer wants to return to her safe, quiet life. The poison has taken hold. The trauma bond is set like concrete. Abandoning all self-preservation, she demands his darkest secrets. Let's analyze this final tragedy together. Dante steps into the light, confessing his role in moving illicit cargo for Kingpin Vittorio. He is a perfect mirror of his master's narcissism, yet she does not run. The most painful lesson of humanity is that sometimes we willingly embrace the fire that destroys us. She is now fully awake and entirely prepared to be swallowed whole by his devastating criminal gravity. Step into the frame with me and let us witness the anatomy of a beautiful, terrifying ruin. The lighting is stark, catching the sharp angles of Dante's face as he lists his sins: guns, stolen art, blood in the shadows. He paints his silence as a heavy iron shield meant only to protect her, a masterful stroke of manipulation. When Ara finally forces the breath from her lungs to ask if he has taken a life, his answer comes without a flicker of hesitation: yes. His cold admission hangs in the quiet air, a ghost that should send her running into the night. Yet, watch the way her shoulders soften. The human heart is a tragic thing. Her survival instinct screams, but her fragile soul is already rewriting this very real monster into a tragic, misunderstood savior. Any rational mind would shatter here, sprinting for the door to escape an admitted killer. But the camera lingers on Ara, lost in a tragic fog, her voice barely above a whisper as she asks to see the rest of his gilded cage. Dante, caught off guard by her submission, leads her through a sweeping labyrinth of 4 echoing bedrooms and 3 pristine bathrooms. It is a sterile, breathtaking set design of wealth, entirely devoid of a soul. The cold marble reflects the emptiness inside him. When she murmurs about the chilling perfection of the space, the kingpin lets his armor slip. He confesses that this mansion is merely a theater, a hollow stage built to project untouchable dominance to his rivals, sacrificing every ounce of human warmth for the bleeding illusion of godhood. You and I have watched this tragedy unfold before. We see her desperately trying to mirror him, comparing his violent deceptions to the tired, painted-on smile she wears to survive her own shifts at work. It is a heartbreaking reach for connection. While Dante orders their food, the lens tracks Ara wandering through the cavernous guest suite, her small belongings looking painfully out of place against the silk and mahogany. Returning to the dim glow of the living room, she watches him move like a general mapping a war. He casually drops the name Castellano, outlining a looming 2 o'clock clash for the following afternoon. He promises the crowded venue will prevent a slaughter, but his shadowed eyes carry the absolute dark promise of inevitable bloodshed. When she asks how he carries the crushing weight of his empire, his answer is steeped in a breathtaking, arrogant sorrow. He frames himself as a cursed titan, the only man capable of holding the absolute darkness at bay. In his mind, his brutality is a beautiful, bleeding sacrifice. 40 minutes later, the silence is broken by a lavish feast of Thai food, delivered by ghosts in the night. The camera pulls back, framing the two of them against the glittering, cold expanse of the Chicago skyline. It feels almost normal, a fatal illusion. Dante shifts the focus to art, and Ara's face lights up. She speaks passionately of Rothko's bleeding colors and the heavy despair of the Renaissance. With every beautiful, trembling word, she hands this predator the very keys to her fragile soul. The lighting shifts, softening the hard lines of Dante's face as he leans in, playing the role of the rapt audience. He mirrors her passion perfectly, setting the hook deep into her heart. Then comes the masterful, tragic turn. He speaks of a piano he once played, a beautiful gift that died 15 years ago when his father's blood stained the family crown, forcing him onto this dark throne. It is a flawless performance of shared sorrow. Ara's remaining defenses crumble like ash. She looks at this killer and sees only a broken artist, much like her own shattered dreams. As they stand side by side washing the dishes, the gentle sound of running water masks the terrifying reality. It is a hauntingly beautiful domestic picture, painted entirely over a ticking time bomb. Let us pause and look closely at the framing of this scene together. Ara wanders alone through the echoing apartment, dwarfed by the cold, expensive art on the walls. Yet, she drifts toward a tiny, unassuming painting of a misty forest. When Dante steps from the shadows to whisper that his mother painted it before she died when he was 17, the trap springs shut. He offers her this perfectly lit morsel of childhood grief, and she takes it. Her eyes well up as she shares the memory of her own father's sudden death when she was only 12. The camera tightens on their faces, capturing the birth of a doomed trauma bond. Dante's face remains a beautiful mask of sympathy, but make no mistake, he does not feel her tragic pain. He is using it to permanently chain her to his dark world. The physical toll of this dark romance is devastating to witness. Ara's voice trembles as she recounts the day her father's heart stopped. An unpredictable nightmare that left her desperate for a safe harbor now. Her body is completely drained, shaking like a leaf in the wind. Dante steps into the frame, a towering pillar of calm, commanding her to rest while he shoulders the weight of the coming war. It is a sickening paradox. She yearns to stay awake beside the very demon who ruined her life, confusing his iron grip for a warm embrace. She slips into the guest bed, the cool, expensive silk soothing her feverish skin. Through the heavy walls, the low, rhythmic hum of Dante speaking Italian acts as a dark lullaby, pulling her down into a deep, completely dangerous slumber. 13 agonizing hours pass in silence. When her eyes finally flutter open, the light in the room is soft, and Dante is already there, a dark phantom, holding a perfectly crafted cup of coffee, right down to the exact splash of cream. It is a terrifying intimacy. He studies her every breath to weave himself into her mind. When Ara whispers that she feels like a ghost drifting through someone else's life, she is unraveling before our eyes. Dante checks his watch, announcing his departure for the 2 o'clock meeting, leaving his shadow, Marco, to guard the door. Watch the panic flood Ara's face. The tragedy is complete. She no longer fears the monster keeping her locked in this ivory tower. Her heart shatters at the mere thought that her beautiful captor might not come back to her. Dante moves gracefully through the kitchen, using the warm, domestic smell of breakfast to paint over the madness of her captivity. When he emerges draped in a sharp charcoal suit, it is the armor of a warlord marching to his doom. He pulls her into his chest, his voice a low whisper as he thanks her for trusting him. You and I know the devastating truth here. She never had a choice. He systematically burned every bridge behind her until he was the only island left. But by calling her surrender a willing embrace, he turns the lock on her psychological cage. As the heavy door clicks shut behind him, Ara is left standing alone in the vast silence. She does not look for a way out. She simply stands there, paralyzed by the agonizing fear that the man who stole her life might bleed for her. The ticking clock becomes the loudest sound in the world. Ara paces the sprawling, silent cage, a beautiful bird trapped far above the indifferent pulse of the city. At 2 o'clock, Marco steps into the frame. He sits quietly with a book, playing the role of a gentle guardian, but his massive frame blocks the only exit. The tension in the room is suffocating. Ara tries to sketch, but her hands tremble violently, her body breaking under the invisible weight of her dread. Then, exactly at 5, the heavy silence shatters. The phone rings. Dante's sharp voice echoes through the speaker, commanding her to pack a bag immediately. The color drains from her face. The master director knows exactly how to keep her heart racing so fast that she can never stop to breathe, only blindly follow his lead. This is the exact frame where her old life burns to the ground. Over the crackling line, Dante reveals that Castellano, the rival king, has found her tiny, quiet apartment. Whether it is true or just another brilliant, sick manipulation, the curtain falls all the same. Her safe haven is gone. Dante smoothly offers to swallow her whole, proposing to move her into his world permanently and pay her the wages she will lose. It is a breathtakingly cruel transaction, wrapping a golden chain around her neck. We watch the tears finally spill over Ara's lashes. She does not want his blood money. She aches for the boring, lonely piece of the life she had just days ago. But that world is ashes now, leaving her clinging desperately to the very man who struck the match. Stay with me for this final, agonizing sequence. Ara begs for a single breath of air, pleading for just a moment to think. Dante magnanimously grants her 1 hour, but the camera lingers on the tragic irony. She has nowhere else to go. Into this terrifying void steps Marco, playing his part in the grand design by pressing a cold vodka tonic into her shaking hand. The liquor blurs the sharp edges of her terror, sinking her deeper into the velvet trap. Watch closely as Ara begins to question the enforcer about his 10 years with the crime family. Her tear-streaked face searches Marco's eyes, begging for a sign that her captor is secretly a savior. It is the ultimate tragedy of the human spirit, desperately painting Stinger halo over a devil just to survive the darkest night. Marco offers the psychological poison she craves, dressed as validation. He insists that Dante, a man carved from pure ruthlessness, is uniquely gentle with her, claiming he has never seen the boss truly care about someone's safety. This is the tragic illusion of exceptionalism. The captive mind convinces itself it has miraculously cured the predator. Drunk on this false empowerment, Ara presents her fragile conditions for surrender. She demands the right to step outside simple tasks to anchor her mind and absolute honesty about the looming violence. It is a heartbreaking negotiation for basic human dignity, disguised as a business deal. The life lesson here is as quiet as it is devastating. Sometimes, when we fiercely believe we are establishing our boundaries, we are merely designing the exact dimensions of our own permanent prison. You and I must look closely at how the final lock clicks into place. Dante lets a heavy pause hang in the air, performing a calculated reluctance before agreeing to her terms. He offers a slow, disarming smile, a weapon deployed to cement her trust. Then he drops the most dangerous word imaginable: home. They glide through the city in armored vehicles, arriving at his Lincoln Park fortress. The warm brownstone aesthetic perfectly masks a maximum security enclosure, heavy iron gates grown shut. They descend into a subterranean garage with a private entrance, leaving 0 witnesses. Ara steps over the threshold into isolation entirely by choice. It is a harsh but necessary life lesson. Safety provided by a violent predator is never a true sanctuary. It is only ever a slightly more comfortable cage. The scene reveals a stark contrast to Dante's sterile displays of power. This hidden apartment is warmly lit, haphazardly cluttered with red-spined books, discarded leather jackets, and unwashed coffee mugs. It is a psychological anomaly for a man violently obsessed with control. He guides Ara inside, his broad shoulders stiff with an awkwardness uncharacteristic of a feared megalomaniac. Ara's gaze drifts to framed photographs, faded images of a mother and a young sister, fragile artifacts of a fractured past. Dante hovers in the doorway, the dim light catching his sudden, jarring vulnerability. The lesson is unavoidable. No matter how deeply into the dark a person wanders, even the hardest, most violent minds leave quiet fragments of their lost humanity hiding in plain sight. Dante offers her food, his commanding presence faltering into nervous gestures. When she softly declines his micromanagement, he admits he is entirely unused to sharing his space. 5 long years of self-imposed exile, constructing mental fortresses so impenetrable that not even his loyal soldiers could breach them. This isolation is the defense mechanism of a dominant predator, terrified of betrayal. Ara counters the tension with a gentle promise to spare his book collection from judgment, bringing a faint, genuine light to his dark eyes. She slowly begins to unpack her meager belongings, just a sketchpad and 2 days of clothes. The lesson is undeniable. Profound isolation breeds its own unique madness, but a single thread of authentic human connection can quickly collapse years of iron walls. Her few possessions look tragic scattered across his heavy furniture, the physical evidence of a life uprooted by trauma. She finds him in the kitchen, stripped of his tailored suits and wearing plain denim. The power dynamic subtly shifts in the shadows. They sit with red wine in an uneasy, loaded silence. When Ara asks about his rival, Castellanos, Dante's voice drops to a chilling, clinical pitch. He admits to weaponizing the rival's daughter, tracking her school to force a ceasefire. Ara feels physically sick at the ruthless implication, even as Dante flatly denies intending to harm the girl. His psychological warfare was utterly flawless. Life teaches us a grim lesson here. Those who hold absolute power are often the ones most willing to exploit the innocent vulnerabilities of others. You and I must carefully examine Ara's reaction as the scene darkens. Dante explains his enemies now view her as a vulnerability. His solution is classic megalomaniac behavior: establish absolute dominance by threatening unspeakable violence against anyone who touches her. He speaks of murder as casually as discussing the weather. Logically, Ara should be repulsed. Instead, she feels a profound, disturbing wave of relief wash over her trembling frame. This is the tragic seed of Stockholm Syndrome taking root. Her mind twists sheer fear into gratitude, finding dark comfort in the monster who promises to keep the other monsters at bay. It is a devastating truth of human nature. We sometimes desperately seek our ultimate safety in the exact fires that originally burned our lives to the ground. Dante confesses that without the violence, he has no remaining identity. It is a classic symptom of a fractured ego, entirely dependent on external dominance to survive. Ara wants to offer an escape, but her own crushed aspirations keep her silent. Instead, she asks for a genuine secret disconnected from his criminal empire. Dante offers a highly calculated piece of vulnerability, a lifelong phobia of dogs, stemming from a childhood incident with a German shepherd. The feared mob boss, secretly terrified of golden retrievers, Ara bursts into helpless laughter at the sheer absurdity. It is a dark masterclass in psychological manipulation. The lesson is clear. True predators know exactly which harmless weaknesses to casually reveal to make their prey feel completely safe in their jaws. When the focus shifts, Ara softly reveals her abandoned ambition to run an art museum. Her voice is briefly animated by the ghost of a former passion, but she quickly shatters her own dream, rationalizing her failure by citing her father's debts and a deep fear of inadequacy. This self-deprecation is typical of victims who shrink themselves to survive. Dante refuses to accept her broken narrative. He validates her talent, pointing out how her face illuminates when discussing art, challenging her core belief that she is not good enough. Overwhelmed by the terrifying sensation of being truly seen, Ara rapidly deflects the conversation to his sister. The lesson is profound. Recognizing someone's buried potential is often the fastest way to completely bypass their heavy emotional defenses. Dante speaks of his sister, Sophia, with a quiet, melancholic reverence. She offered a legitimate escape after their father died, but he chose the underworld instead. He clinically diagnoses his own youthful arrogance, the delusion that he could rule a criminal empire while keeping his conscience pure. He states a fundamental law of his violent reality. One cannot exist halfway in the dark. It is total consumption or death. The silence that follows is thick with the suffocating weight of irreversible decisions. To break the tension, he shifts to the mundane task of cooking dinner, drawing Ara into the small kitchen alongside him. This proves a deadly truth. The most dangerous traps we ever fall into are the ones we confidently believe we can walk away from at any time. Stick with me. This is where the psychological dynamic fractures. As garlic sizzles in the pan, Dante bitterly dismantles Ara's attempts to romanticize him. He states his reality with brutal precision. He kills people. He runs a syndicate. He is the monster his mother feared. But Ara, deeply entrenched in Stockholm Syndrome, insists on viewing him through extreme rationalization, highlighting his protective traits to justify her attachment. The cognitive dissonance is deafening. Unable to process her blind acceptance, Dante crosses the room and kisses her violently. It is a desperate collision of intense guilt and overwhelming possession. In life, we frequently project pure goodness onto deeply broken people, simply because facing their true darkness is far too terrifying for our fragile minds. Let's look at this piece by piece. We see the classic push and pull dynamic immediately taking hold in the shadows. He offers a weak apology for the sudden kiss, a calculated display of false vulnerability. She responds by stepping forward and pulling him back into an embrace. This exact moment is the dark inception of the trauma bond. You and I are going to unpack this together, observing how Stockholm Syndrome easily takes root in a willing subject. She whispers that she no longer cares about the physical danger of his world. The bitter lesson here is simple, yet deeply tragic. When a person is starved for basic human visibility, they will gladly step right into the crosshairs just to finally feel seen. Her fragile ego makes her the perfect supply for his megalomaniac tendencies. The camera pushes in to observe her cognitive distortion happening in real time. Ara frames his face with trembling hands, verbally erasing his violent criminal identity. She claims she sees only the man, completely ignoring the monster. This is a desperate defense mechanism for the captive psyche, the absolute idealization of the captor. He kisses her again, sealing the moment as both a promise and a dark threat, cementing his dominance. They quietly finish preparing the meal, the warm domesticity acting as a bizarre counterweight to psychological imprisonment. The underlying truth of human behavior is that we will quickly normalize the abnormal just to survive. Every accidental touch at that small table is merely another heavy neurological tether binding her to a dangerous sociopath. The camera pans slowly from the heavy oak doors, where Dante orchestrates a brutal, bleeding empire in clipped Italian to the dim living room. Here sits Ara, curled on a velvet sofa, soaking in the ambient terror like a moth drawn to a dying bulb. When the heavy doors finally click open, the silence is deafening. Dante leans against the frame, shadowed, rubbing his temples, a portrait of engineered exhaustion. He points out her worn revenge novel, whispering that he only wants to survive another night. The lighting softens, framing him not as a monster, but as a martyr. It is a flawless, tragic performance. The bitter truth we must all learn is that the darkest predators never ever cast themselves as the villain. They only ever play the weary survivor. The last walls of her sanity crumble under the sheer weight of exhaustion. He lifts her easily, carrying her to the massive bed. A beautiful, terrifying choreography of complete dominance dressed up as a lover's tender rescue. Look closely at its frame, because you and I have both seen this trap before. Her fingers grip his dark lapels. She begs him not to leave. He offers a hollow warning about the poison in his blood, knowing it will only pull her deeper. She whispers that he just needs someone to believe in him. It breaks the heart. Trying to mend a deeply shattered soul will only ever leave you bleeding from their broken edges. He brushes his lips against her forehead, sealing the curse, and watches her slip into a defenseless sleep. Dawn bleeds grey light through the high, arched windows. She is entirely alone now, save for the silent shadow of Marco standing guard beyond the heavy front door. Her soft footsteps map the edges of her gilded cage until she stops before a grand piano, buried under a fine layer of dust. Hesitantly, she presses a key. A fragile, innocent melody echoes in the vast room, but the air suddenly drops 10 degrees. Dante fills the doorway, his posture rigid, plunging her back into absolute submission. She stammers an apology just for breathing his air. He coldly states he no longer plays. The tragedy of a violent life is that a man must bury every soft and beautiful thing inside himself just to survive, dragging that heavy, hollow chest through the world forever. But she does not shrink away. She pushes him to sit, to touch the keys. For a man who writes his life in blood, this is a masterclass in calculated vulnerability. His scarred hands hover over the ivory, muscle memory dragging out a haunting, melancholy piece by Chopin. It is unpolished, yet dripping with a raw, agonizing sorrow that paints his brutal nature in tragic, romantic hues. She whispers how beautiful it is. A bitter, self-deprecating smile touches the corner of his mouth as he mutters that even monsters are allowed to have hobbies. It strips away her final defense. We have to remember that a beautiful melody does not erase a history of cruelty. So often, charm and art are just the velvet gloves that violence wears to hold our hands. In the quiet dimness of the room, she weaves her own fatal illusion, telling him that even the darkest souls deserve a glimpse of light. She crowns herself as his singular savior. He anchors this tragedy with a slow, agonizing kiss, murmuring against her lips that he will utterly destroy her. To her fevered mind, it is a promise of passion, not a threat. They let the afternoon drift by in a quiet domestic pantomime. But as the shadows lengthen, the predator springs the trap. He casually mentions that the entire syndicate will know she belongs to him by tonight. This is no grand romance. It is the branding of a prized possession. The quiet lesson here is that when a monster builds a wall to protect you, they are also building your permanent prison. The camera lingers on her face as the irreversible weight of his words settles in. He tells her, with eyes as cold as black ice, that the underworld will now see her as his sole property. Where a sane mind would shatter in terror, a tragic, breathless glow illuminates her features. She feels chosen. He whispers that having her near makes him look human to the wolves, twisting his possessive grip into a confession of a terrified boy afraid of losing his only light. She is no longer a woman with a future. She is merely an anchor tied to a drowning man. The greatest tragedy of trying to save a drowning soul is that you rarely pull them out of the water. You just become the heavy stone they drag down into the deep, dark abyss alongside them. The tragic opera enters its darkest act as he weaponizes his own history. She demands the raw truth, blindly convinced her heart is strong enough to hold his demons. The lighting cuts sharply across Dante's face as he exhales, slowly unfurling the nightmare of Maria, a former lover ripped from her home and held in a lightless box for 3 agonizing days. He paints the gruesome picture so vividly, flipping the script from his own ruthless lifestyle to the tragedy of his bleeding heart. Ara is left feeling like the ultimate exception, driven deeper into his suffocating shadow for safety. If we listen closely, the truth is clear. A broken man will gladly lay out the bones of his past victims just to build a fence around the one he currently holds captive. He pulls away from her warmth, the muscles in his jaw ticking as his voice drops into an empty, deadened hum. He details how Maria survived the physical torment, but the sheer horror snapped her mind in two, forcing her to vanish into the wind. It is a blazing warning sign painted in blood. When Ara softly asks if he found the men responsible, his eyes go utterly vacant. He quietly describes erasing them from the earth, the men, their families, their home, turned to grey ash, absolute, unholy ruin. Any simple person would have sprinted for the door, yet she roots her feet to the floorboards. It is a heartbreaking flaw in our human design that we can look at a blazing, catastrophic fire of pure violence and somehow mistake it for the warmth of true love. This is the exact moment the steel trap snaps, completely shut over her soul. A clear mind would have shattered a window to escape that room. Instead, watch how the camera follows her as she steps closer, burying her face into his chest, entirely erasing the line between her quiet life and his war zone. She convinces herself that standing beside the devil is safer than hiding behind his guards. When his arms finally crush around her, his massive frame shaking, she reads his adrenaline-soaked tremors as a desperate cry for affection. She promises they will burn in this fire together, offering up her identity on a silver platter. She locks her own cage from the inside. We lose ourselves the moment we tie our survival to the very storm that is tearing us apart. Notice how the simple, suffocating word hangs in the air. He calls her his girl. It is a brand burned onto her skin, yet it sends a warm thrill of submission down her spine instead of cold panic. She whispers a vow to stay, sealing her fate in blood and breath. Later, wrapped in the shadows of the guest quarters, while he commands his empire through the walls, she stares at the ceiling. She maps out the absolute insanity of it all. Sleeping under the roof of a killer, waiting for a gangland war at dawn, but the sickness has already taken root deep in her chest. The most terrifying trick the mind can play is taking a pitch-black descent into a living nightmare and wrapping it up in the soft, deceitful feeling of finally coming home. Let us pause and look into her eyes in the quiet dark. Listening to the low, violent murmur of his voice through the plaster, she feels a sick, twisted peace. But when the grey dawn breaks, the brutal reality of the daylight hits her like a physical blow. She is a hostage dressing for war. She pulls on dark, shapeless clothes, instinctively trying to shrink away from the coming violence. In the stark, sterile light of the kitchen, Dante waits. He is carved in a bespoke suit, looking every inch the flawless, untouchable king. He notes her trembling hands. His voice is a low rumble of absolute arrogance, promising they will bow to her simply because he demands it. The saddest truth of the human condition is that we often learn to adore the monster, just so the monster won't eat us. He promises that anyone who fails to show respect will simply cease to exist. He says this the way one might talk about the weather. He grips her waist, pulling her flush against his chest in a terrifying display of absolute ownership. He commands her never to lower her eyes again, decreeing that his shadow makes her immortal. The scene shifts to the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of a massive, derelict warehouse. Dozens of hardened, silent men circle a vast table. As Dante steps through the heavy iron doors, his fingers locked like a vice around her hand, the immense room goes completely dead. He is not holding her out of love. He is parading his newest prize. A king's power means absolutely nothing if he does not have a captive audience to watch him wield it. You and I must look closely at Ara as she stands before this court of wolves. We are watching the final collapse of her old self. Her entire life, she survived by fading into the background. But here, bathed in the harsh industrial light and surrounded by murderers, she actually lifts her chin. She mistakes this reckless defiance for bravery. In truth, she is just a drowning woman clinging desperately to the very shark that circled her. Dante tightens his grip, his voice slicing through the silence as he promises death to any man who looks at her too long. When a soldier steps out of line, Dante crushes him with a single, icy stare. The tragic lesson we leave with is that true strength is only born from walking alone. You can never find your own power by hiding behind the man who holds your leash. The camera lingers on the heavy silence of the room. Dante's jaw sets as he claims Ara as his own, a possessive phrase that hangs in the air like an iron chain. You and I can see the tragedy taking shape in the shadows. Elena leans into the dim light, asking if Ara truly understands the endless violence she is stepping into. Ara's hands tremble, yet, staring into the dark eyes of her captor, she forces her voice to remain steady, declaring she chooses this cage. Elena smiles, misinterpreting this desperate instinct as a form of tragic bravery. It is a devastating moment that reminds us of a simple truth. We often mistake our desperate survival mechanisms for genuine free will, falling in love with the very cages we cannot escape. The lighting shifts, casting sharp shadows across Dante's face as he cements his absolute control over the room. He introduces his men, and the camera focuses tightly on Ara's widening eyes. Standing right there is the very man who assaulted her. The color drains from her cheeks. Her mind violently blurs the horrific reality into a detached numbness. They study her face, branding her as the property of the kingpin. She knows the crushing weight of this ownership should suffocate her. Yet, her fractured mind twists the terror into a protective shield, telling herself this loss of freedom is the only way to stay alive. It teaches us a sobering lesson. When humans are stripped of their safety, they will desperately seek comfort in the very hands that took it away. The scale of his criminal empire settles over her like a suffocating blanket. With a flick of his wrist, Dante allows her to sit, managing her exhaustion as if she were merely another asset on his ledger. The camera pans to his cold expression. The warmth he showed her has vanished. In its place stands the terrifying boss, ruthlessly crushing any trace of defiance in the room. Instead of pulling away, Ara feels her tragic bond deepen. She finds a sick pride in being chosen by the predator everyone else fears. As the room empties, Elena stays behind, warning Ara not to let this darkness change her. But the tragedy is already in motion. We learn a hard truth here. You cannot compromise with a toxic environment without losing pieces of your own soul. Elena leans close, whispering that he is a good man in a terrible business. It is a heartbreaking lie. Well, the kind enablers build to excuse the unforgivable. When Dante returns, Ara's shoulders slump as she confesses her deep terror. His touch is calculated, rewarding her submission with a gentle stroke of her hair, anchoring her further into his shadow. The scene shifts to a warmly lit restaurant where the owner greets Dante with open arms, painting a tragic illusion of a normal lunch. Ara desperately clings to this soft lighting, pretending the blood on his hands does not exist. But the reality remains quietly sinister. We must always remember one thing. A moment of peace inside a toxic dynamic does not mean the danger is gone. It merely means the threat is resting. Let us look at this frame by frame, shall we? The camera closes in as Alara asks about the death of Dante's father. Dante's posture remains rigidly straight. There is no grief in his eyes, only a cold calculation of the empire he inherited. He admits his early failures nearly destroyed everything. A crack in his armor that he covers up with a hyper-violent arrogance. When asked about his regrets, his chilling indifference fills the quiet room, and Alara, deeply lost in her tragic trauma bond, rushes in to soothe the monster. She defends his brutal methods, painting his cruelty as nothing more than a tragic necessity for survival. The lesson here is profound and deeply sad. We often rewrite the morality of those we love just so we can survive being around them. The sun filters through grey clouds as they stroll through a quiet neighborhood. To any stranger, it looks like romance, but the camera pulls back, revealing Marco trailing them like a dark shadow. Dante walks among the innocent while remaining invisible, a predator hiding in plain sight. He whispers to Alara that this invisibility is their shield. This is the moment her tragedy sets in. After a lifetime of feeling broken, she finds twisted comfort in his terrifying power. Standing next to the most lethal man in the city, she actually feels safe. It is a chilling picture of trauma. The human mind will contort itself into terrifying shapes to feel protected, but true safety is always an illusion when your sanctuary is built by the very monster you should fear. The heavy doors close as Dante leaves, giving Ara a fleeting moment of peace. The room fills with the mournful notes of the piano as she desperately tries to reconnect with the innocent girl she used to be. But the illusion shatters the moment he returns. He sits on the bench and forces his hands onto the keys, injecting his dark presence into her private refuge. You and I can see what this really is. It is not a tender moment. The narcissist cannot allow his victim to have a joy that does not belong to him. They share a soft laugh over a missed note, and the suffocating reality of her cage fades away into the music. It leaves us with a painful thought. True love requires giving someone the space to breathe and be themselves, not consuming their entire world. Watch closely as the fragile domestic illusion shatters. The ring of the phone acts like a gunshot in the quiet room. Dante's posture instantly hardens, his jaw locks, and the warm lover is replaced by the calculating predator. A rival has burned a warehouse, and Ara's nervous system spikes with pure terror. She asks what he will do, even though the devastating answer is already written in the sharp lines of his face. Violence is his only language. He orders Marco to lock her away, stripping her of the world bleed. As he turns, she sees the absolute void in his eyes. And yet, entirely consumed by her trauma bond, she weeps and begs the monster to promise he will come back to her. The tragic lesson is clear. We often desperately seek our safety in the very fires that burn us to the ground. Notice how he manipulates her attachment. His face softens, whispering a promise to return. It is a masterclass in securing loyalty before marching off to war. He leaves her locked in the dark under Marco's watch. To the world, Marco is a bodyguard. Inside this tragedy, he is, well, merely a warden, left alone in the suffocating silence. Ara's mind begins to tear. Marco casually reminds her that Dante is the threat, sending her thoughts spiraling. She is paralyzed by terror for the predator, yet unable to survive without him. Every passing headlight on the wall feels like an executioner arriving. Finally, at 3 in the morning, the heavy lock clicks open. The lesson is haunting. Isolation will force the mind to crave the very poison that is slowly killing it. Let us unpack this devastating pivot together. Ara races across the room, driven by raw desperation. Dante steps into the light, his shirt soaked in blood. A healthy mind would recoil, but Ara immediately checks his body for wounds. His face is terrifyingly blank. With sociopathic detachment, he calmly announces he has just slaughtered an entire rival syndicate. 12 lives, erased in the dark. He looks into her eyes and weaponizes her guilt, claiming he committed this massacre solely to keep her safe. A rational person would run, but the trauma bond has rotted away her moral compass. Instead of screaming, she pulls the murderer tightly against her chest. The life lesson here is deeply tragic. When we lose our sense of self, we will willingly build our homes in the darkest of hearts. When looking back at this tragedy, we search for the exact frame where her fracture becomes permanent. For Ara, it begins with a trembling breath and a whispered apology. She cries into his blood-stained chest, saying she is sorry. It is the heartbreaking response of a hostage trying to placate a volatile captor. The words hang heavy in the dimly lit room, a bid to soothe the primal violence radiating from his skin. She is begging for forgiveness over a massacre she had no part in, laying the final bricks of her trauma bond. She wrongly believes that if she carries the weight of his sins, she can somehow tame the monster inside him. We must learn from her tragic mistake. You can never control someone else's darkness by taking the blame for the shadows they create. The camera catches the arrogant tilt of Dante's head as he asserts terrifying control. "Do not be," he commands softly. With those words, he strips away the last shred of her emotional agency. This was always coming. You were just the excuse. Notice the chilling grandiosity in his tone. He absolves her of the guilt, while simultaneously shrinking her down to nothing. He paints his homicidal rage as an unstoppable force of nature, making sure she understands the predator inside him was always awake, simply waiting for a convenient trigger. The screen fades to black on her devoted eyes, leaving us with one final, haunting realization. The cruelest monsters do not just break your spirit, they convince you that you ask them to do it. The camera pushes in close. We see an apex predator feigning a fatal wound. His shoulders slump. He buries his face into the soft strands of Ara's hair, the harsh lighting suddenly feeling like a confessional. "I need a shower," he whispers, his voice carefully hollowed out. Today, you and I are going to unpack this terrible moment together. By playing the broken man, he forces her empathy to completely silence her basic survival instincts. She swallows hard, nodding slowly. "Okay," she murmurs. In her eyes, he is no longer a monster dripping with consequence. He is just a wounded man who needs her. Here is the tragic truth we must learn. The most dangerous cages are the ones we willingly unlock for the people we pity. The air hangs heavy, thick with the sharp, metallic stench of fresh violence. As Dante slowly pulls away, the reality of the scene paints itself across Ara's vision. Deep, wet crimson soaks into the fabric of his dark shirt, coating his large hands like a second skin. It is the undeniable aftermath of a savage, intimate slaughter. Anyone else would run. Any normal mind would scream, turn, and bolt for the nearest exit to escape the horror. Instead, The camera captures Ara standing absolutely frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Her mind simply shuts down the terror, wrapping her in a cold blanket of shock. Let it be known, when the heart cannot process the terror standing right in front of it, the mind will build a fortress of ice just to survive the night. "Join me," he murmurs, the command masquerading as a gentle plea. Watch the framing here. This isn't about romance, and it certainly isn't about desire. A man like Dante refuses to stand alone in the dark with the ghosts of the men he just slaughtered. He needs something pure to hold on to, an anchor to stop him from drowning in his own absolute darkness. By pulling Ara into the steam and the heat, he is making her wash the guilt directly from his skin. Her hands will carry the stain of his survival. We are witnessing the tragic moment a soul is shared without permission. The lesson here is as old as time itself. When you help a dangerous man wash away his sins, you inevitably end up wearing his guilt as your own. They stand together beneath the punishing heat of the shower, wrapped in a heavy, suffocating silence. The camera focuses on the drain at their feet. The water spirals down in thick, arterial ribbons of red, slowly fading into a bruised pink, and finally running clear. Ara's trembling hands move methodically over the hard planes of his back, and his heavily muscled arms, scrubbing away the violent evidence of his absolute power. He stands there with his eyes closed, absorbing her touch like a fallen king receiving devotion. It is a devastating picture of submission. She is scrubbing away the horror, making it acceptable. Remember this. The moment we start cleaning up the wreckage of someone else's cruelty, we quietly accept it as a permanent part of our own lives. Once the physical residue of the slaughter is completely washed down the drain, the illusion of safety slowly returns to the quiet room. The harsh bathroom light casts long, tragic shadows against the wet tiles. Dante steps out, grabbing a clean white towel, leaving Ara shivering under the fading heat of the water. Her eyes stare blankly at the spotless porcelain, desperately trying to unsee what she has just touched. The physical blood is gone, but the invisible stain now rests heavily on her own shoulders. She dries off in silence, moving like a ghost trapped in a house she cannot leave. It is a simple, tragic truth we often learn too late. You can wash away the physical evidence of a terrible night, but the emotional memory will stain your hands forever. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? This is the exact frame where the steel trap snaps completely shut. Dante goes behind her back, forging her application to a highly elite academic institute. When the fire of her anger flares up, he instantly drops to one knee. The lighting softens. He looks up at her from this beautifully calculated, submissive angle, claiming he only wants to hand her back her stolen dreams. He will pay the tuition. He will secure her future. Ara stands there, overwhelmed by the grand gesture, her righteous fury melting into a tragic puddle of gratitude. She thinks she has finally won her freedom, completely blind to the iron bars closing around her. It is a harsh reality of human nature. Total control often was the beautiful mask of romantic generosity. Notice the sheer tragedy of how our deepest hopes are weaponized against her. She desperately craves independence, and the bait is simply too sweet to refuse. The moment she whispers her acceptance, a dark smirk touches his lips as he tells her she will be staying with him for a very long time. She mistakes this terrifying claim of ownership for a passionate vow of love. The camera cuts back and forth between her two fractured worlds. By day, she sits in sunlit lecture halls, debating the soft strokes of Renaissance art. By night, she crawls into the heavy silk sheets of a man who commands violence with the flick of a wrist. The weight of these two clashing lives is tearing her mind apart. The lesson is clear. Living a double life will eventually split your soul right down the middle. The camera pulls back to show Ara sitting at a crowded campus cafe, surrounded by chatter, yet entirely alone. Her classmates sit in the warm afternoon sun, casually complaining about trust funds and weekend plans. Ara smiles, nodding along, hiding the heavy, explosive secret sitting in her chest. When a girl named Jessica leans in, laughing over her drink and joking that Ara must be in witness protection, the blood drains from Ara's face. She forces out a hollow, perfectly practiced laugh. To throw them off the scent, she quickly mentions her old shifts serving tables at a local diner. She is actively burying her real self to protect the man keeping her prisoner. We must always remember, keeping a toxic secret will always demand the slow, quiet sacrifice of your own true identity. Ara walks home through the fading evening light, acutely aware that the cheerful students around her have no concept of the brutal shadows commanded by men like Dante. When she finally steps back into his massive, dimly lit penthouse, the tragedy of her captivity peaks. Exhausted from wearing a mask all day, she actually collapses into the arms of the very man destroying her. Dante strokes her hair, his voice a low, commanding rumble, as he strictly forbids her from ever telling the truth. He spins her isolation into a beautiful romance, whispering corporate lies about his violent empire to soothe her racing heart. You and I have to see the danger here. Seeking your comfort from the exact same person who causes your pain is a guaranteed way to lose yourself completely in the dark. The scene shifts, plunging into the cold reality of his manipulation. Dante paces the floor, his movements sharp, testing the absolute limits of her loyalty. He pushes her, mentioning that others doubt her strength. When Ara defensively lifts her chin and claims she knows exactly what he is, Dante shatters the illusion. He steps so close she can feel his heat, forcing her to picture the cold, unyielding steel of a loaded gun pressed directly against her temple. He demands to know what she will do when his violent world finally comes knocking at her door. The color completely leaves her face as the romantic fog evaporates, leaving only raw terror. The stark life lesson is undeniably clear. Ignoring the early red flags only guarantees that you will eventually have to face the storm. Stick with me here, because this is where the tragedy sets itself in stone. Dante graciously steps back, offering her an open door to leave, fully knowing he has already locked the cage around her mind. Ara doesn't run. Instead, she steps forward, her trembling hands reaching up to cup his face, vowing she will never leave his side. He pulls her into a desperate kiss, hiding his own terrified need for her submission. As the harsh winter freezes the city, her internal ruin bleeds out into her schoolwork. She curates an art exhibit that violently throws classical holy martyrs against modern cruelty. It is a stunning visual scream for help. This teaches us a crucial truth. The human mind will always find a creative way to express the profound pain we refuse to speak aloud. The warm art studio is replaced by stark, sleepless shadows. Ara buries herself under mountains of canvas and research, running on empty adrenaline and cold coffee. The camera watches her move with a frantic, desperate energy. Dante stands in the doorway, his eyes tracking her manic spiral with dark fascination before he steps in, gently taking the brush from her hand like a concerned father. But Ara's mind is completely fractured. She looks up at him with hollow eyes. She entirely convinced she has to work herself to the bone to earn the money he spent on her. She is trading her health for his approval. This is a clear warning to us all. Burning yourself out to prove your basic worth to a toxic partner will eventually destroy everything beautiful about you. The vibration of her phone shatters the quiet afternoon. A single message from Dante. The romance is instantly dead, replaced by the freezing, tactical bark of a cornered kingpin. He tells her to be afraid, using her raw terror to guarantee her absolute obedience. His enforcer pulls up. Ara dives into the black sedan. The heavy metallic thud of the locks is sealing her fate. As the car tears through the city streets, she doesn't cry for her lost freedom. She doesn't scream at the madness. She merely stares at the rearview mirror and quietly asks if his old rival has come back to kill them. Her entire moral universe has shrunk down to keeping her captor alive. It is a haunting lesson. Accepting continuous chaos will eventually destroy your basic compass for right and wrong. We are going to look at this final frame together because it is the absolute end of the line. Ara is dragged into a stark, windowless safe house, completely cut off from the world. Dante meets her in the center of the room, pulling her into an embrace so tight it physically forces the air from her lungs. He checks her face and hands with the cold eyes of a man inspecting his most expensive property. He casually whispers that dodging bullets is just how he lives, using the sheer terror of the night to prove he was right all along. Ara stands there, her hands shaking so violently she can barely hold them still. The door is bolted. The light fades. The ultimate lesson we take away from this tragedy: trading your autonomy for protection will always leave you defenseless in the dark. Let us open this scene together, you and I, and observe the immediate wreckage of a human soul. The camera lingers on Ara, her chest heaving in distress. She whispers her frantic fear of losing him, a classic echo of Stockholm Syndrome, where her universe shrinks to the silhouette of her captor. Dante stands in the shadows of the safe house, a megalomaniac, unable to stomach his failure. Notice the cold lighting on his tense jaw. There is no relief in his eyes, only a glacial vow to obliterate the rival who exposed his weakness. His empty voice sends a primal shiver down her spine, a biological alarm she tragically misinterprets as profound devotion. We often mistake the fire that warms us for the fire that will ultimately burn us down. Watch how the camera frames this agonizing isolation. Dante departs at dawn to enact his vengeance, his voice flat as he commands Ara to remain confined. He dictates her every breathing moment while he bathes the city in violence. Hour by hour, Ara paces the floor. Her anxiety is not for her own freedom, but for the safe return of the architect of her imprisonment. This is the suffocating tragedy of a trauma bond. When Dante stumbles in at 3 a.m, his arm is brutally dislocated, his clothing heavy with blood. Yet his pride holds firm. He flatly refuses a hospital, prioritizing criminal secrecy over his failing body. He forces Ara to kneel as his caregiver, binding her to his survival. Life teaches us a dark lesson here. We often bleed the most for those who hand us the blade. The lens captures the terrifying weight of her compliance. Any rational person would run, but Ara silences her instinct to seek help, entirely cowed by his authoritative stare. As her trembling fingers bandage his lacerations, her eerie calm reveals a fragile defense. She is dissociating. While she works, Dante clinically recounts the massacre. He described executing the rival and every witness with a flat, hollow tone devoid of a single ounce of remorse. When she asks if the violence will ever stop, his response freezes the room. There is always another enemy, he whispers. In his fractured mind, this perpetual war justifies his absolute control over her life. It is a tragic reality that fear will always build the tallest, most inescapable prisons. Stick with me here, because this scene pivots into pure darkness. Dante outlines the brutal violence of his world, stating his nature will never change. Consciously, Ara recognizes the absurdity. She is wiping the brow of a mass murderer. She knows she should run, yet the roots of her syndrome choke out all self-preservation. She presses her lips against the predator's forehead, swearing unwavering loyalty. When the underground medic arrives to set the torn shoulder, the cold detachment in the room normalizes the nightmare. He instructs Ara to manage Dante's recovery. She guides the medicated kingpin to bed, embracing her role as his devoted accomplice. A haunting reminder, our most destructive choices often masquerade as acts of love. The camera pushes in to examine the pathology of her affection. Ara sits by the bed, tracing the physical evidence of his brutality, the dark bruises, the jagged suturing. She actively weaves this violence into her romanticized view of his soul, finding a perverse harmony between his lethal nature and his gestures of support. She rationalizes his narcissistic cage as a fortress of profound love. This acceptance marks her complete psychological surrender. When his eyes open, Dante initiates a performative display of guilt, softly suggesting she should flee. It is merely a cruel test of her conditioning. Ara immediately shushes him, pressing a hand to his lips. She has internalized his dark reality as her own. The tragic lesson is clear. We truly lose ourselves the moment we start falling in love with our own chains. In an agonizing close-up, Ara burns every bridge to sanity, whispering that she understands what he is. She absolves him of his monstrous nature. For a megalomaniac, this is the ultimate victory, to be worshipped because of his atrocities, not despite them. Dante grips her face, demanding eternal possession. He promises to keep her forever, delivering a life sentence, wrapped as a romantic vow. They exchange breathless confessions, mistaking their shared terror for genuine intimacy. Their tears are merely a violent release of neurochemical stress, the trauma bond cementing itself in their brains. They marinate in this bunker for 3 days, completely severed from the world. Their return home feels like soldiers coming back from war. We learn here that the most dangerous lies are the ones we build together in the dark. You and I must look at how this trauma bleeds into the light of day. Ara channels her psychological distortion onto the canvas. She paints the intersection of violence and beauty, a visceral sublimation of her life with the kingpin. Her advisors praise the dark work as mature, utterly blind that they are applauding the documentation of an active hostage situation. When a peer questions her inspiration, Ara's eyes harden. She attributes it vaguely to life, fiercely protecting her captive reality. The mood shifts as Dante arrives, flanked by his armed enforcers. He infiltrates her safe civilian environment, gliding through the gallery crowd like an untouchable apex predator. His presence is a suffocating assertion of dominance, cleverly masquerading as the quiet support of a partner. We often hang our deepest wounds in plain sight. Dante stands before her painting, quietly comparing her creation to his criminal destruction. This is a classic narcissistic mirroring technique. By elevating her darkness to his level, he ensures his validation remains her emotional currency. Over the next months, their lives fall into a pattern of chaotic stability. They fight over his violent lifestyle, yet the intermittent reinforcement of his affection keeps her chained. The vigilance of his empire becomes her new baseline. By July, the kingpin orchestrates a return to the exact restaurant where he first acquired her. It is a highly symbolic frame, initiating the final phase of his possession. Under the dim lights, He slides a small box across the table. Ara stares at it, and her heart physically stops. The saddest truth is that perfect captivity often feels exactly like destiny. We now witness the devastating capitalization on her compromised mind. Dante acknowledges he is a danger she should flee, yet he demands her permanent submission anyway. He weaponizes his pathology, packaging his violent obsession as a tragic romance. Ara views the heavy diamond ring not as a shackle, but as a testament to their survival. She eagerly consents. As he slips the ring onto her finger, the camera lingers. It is the formal sealing of the trauma bond. He whispers that he does not deserve her, a manipulative play that forces his victim to comfort him. They announce the engagement to his syndicate, and a lieutenant praises Ara as braver than a soldier. The applause normalizes her permanent descent into an inescapable psychiatric prison. The lesson is chilling. Even the most beautiful cages are built to break your wings. Jenna enters the frame to provide a vital clinical baseline. She represents objective reality, identifying the terminal risk of marrying a kingpin. Observe Ara's defense mechanisms. She deploys radical minimization, arguing that 6 chaotic months with a murderer hold more value than a lifetime of safety. Ara defends her captor by highlighting his rare gentleness, falsely believing he grants her autonomy. In truth, Dante exerts total coercive control, masking his iron grip as fierce protection. The megalomaniac has convinced his victim she is the center of his universe. Tragically, exhausted by the delusion, even the rational friend surrenders to this narrative, validating a lethal dependency. The lesson is grim but simple. Our deep hunger for affection frequently blinds us to our own destruction. The wedding introduces Dante's sister, the sole voice of accountability. She understands his psychopathy with cold precision. Notice the tension as she offers the bride an immediate exit strategy. She knows terror frequently masquerades as affection. Yet Ara rejects the escape route entirely. She cements her own captivity, actively choosing the peril. This is the tragic apex of Stockholm Syndrome, the captive passionately defending her right to remain in the cage. Defeated, the sister accepts this, issuing a violent threat against her brother as emotional insurance. They formalize this bond in an isolated garden, guarded by armed mercenaries. We are not witnessing a celebration of matrimony. We are observing the absolute securing of a willing hostage. The darkest prisons are always locked from the inside. Let's look at their vows through a behavioral lens. Ara speaks of choosing love over fear, rationally realizing the lethal threat of her environment. Dante pledges absolute protection, reinforcing his role as an omnipotent guardian. The redemption is an echo chamber where enablers praise her bravery, celebrating her willingness to endure psychological distress. Later, Ara finds Dante staring over the dark city he violently controls. He admits to feeling terrified, but we must understand the pathology here. True narcissists rarely fear emotional loss. They are terrified of losing control over their primary supply. The wedding bands they wear are not symbols of romantic devotion. To his fractured psyche, they represent the visual markers of absolute ownership. Love is a powerful word, but for a predator, it is merely a chain. Look closely at the framing of this scene. You and I must watch the shadows clinging to Ara. She waits for the crash, shoulders tight with hypervigilance. Dante simply stands in the warm light, his god complex making him feel invincible. Soon, she secures a curatorial role. In response, he quietly buys her a private studio. It looks like love, but notice the cold blocking. He hands her a crumb of independence to guarantee her loyalty. Meanwhile, the predator softens his steps. He returns to the grand piano, letting music mask his violent empire, and speaks of clean ventures. Do not mistake this elegant lighting for a moral dawn. The lesson is bitter. A cornered monster never seeks true redemption. He only changes his camouflage to keep his kingdom under his thumb. The camera pushes in on Dante. At 39, the silver at his temples hints at a violent toll. He starts an exit strategy, realizing the assassin's bullet is drawing near. He asks Ara if she desires a clean life, framing his self-preservation as a romantic gesture. Over 2 years, he liquidates his empire, buying into sunlit real estate and shipping fleets. He claims the old Dante is dead. Yet, through the director's lens, the megalomaniac remains untouched. He merely traded dark alleyways for sterile boardrooms, weaponizing the same ruthless psychology within the law. Ara stays anchored to him, mistaking a tactical retreat for a healed soul. It leaves us with a vital truth. A predator, wrapped in a sharp, tailored suit, is still fundamentally a creature born to hunt. Stay with me, because the blocking of this sequence is tragically poetic. Alara opens a major exhibition centered on violence, putting her trauma on public display. Dante has now laundered his reputation, hiding his syndicate behind corporate logos. On the night of her triumph, the gallery empties. Watch the subtle shift in his posture. He steps close and reclaims her victory, whispering how he personally buried every obstacle in her path. And heaven help her, she actually thanks him. The agonizing life lesson here is undeniable. When you owe your greatest success to a dangerous man, you haven't truly found freedom. You have merely traded a rusted iron cage for a beautiful, gilded one. The contrast in this frame is deeply haunting. Standing amidst painted scenes of destruction, they ask one another if they are truly happy. Without hesitation, both whisper yes. They have romanticized their nightmares, framing a bloody history of cruelty as a beautiful struggle. Alara looks at his hands that ordered murders but now play the piano, and believes she has rehabilitated a broken man. It is the tragic climax of a savior complex colliding with Stockholm Syndrome. She sees his corporate life as absolute proof of his devotion. But the brutal life lesson here is clear. You can never love the poison out of a venomous creature. A predator never changes his core nature. He simply learns to hunt in a softer environment, to keep his most prized possession asleep in his arms. You and I must look at this final act to see the true tragedy. 5 years after their collision, the camera finds them sharing a sprawling estate, a monument built on shared delusion. Alara's posture reveals everything. She accepts her role as the fragile woman saved by a monster who found his humanity. On the sunlit porch, Dante leans in and asks if she has any regrets, pulling invisible strings to reaffirm his control. Looking at the horizon, she calls their survival cosmic luck, blind to the trauma that bound them. They truly believe their broken pieces have forged a cure. But the story leaves us with a sobering life lesson. Sometimes, the quiet peace we desperately call a cure is merely the silent symptom of a fatal disease. As the screen fades to black, we witness their ultimate tragedy. What started as a dropped glass in a restaurant has metastasized into a suffocating existence. Watch how they cling to each other against the city skyline. They define this sickness as true love, framing it as a romantic risk rather than a crippling dependency. They convinced themselves fractured souls could forge a healthy whole, just by carrying their darkness together. As the city hums below, Dante wraps his arms around her in a heavy, inescapable embrace. It leaves us with one final tear-jerking lesson. The human heart is so starved for connection that it will normalize absolute chaos. It will gladly paint the cold iron bars of its own psychological prison in the warm colors of romance, calling it a victory.